So good afternoon. Thank you for choosing this session, which is about psychosis and dissociation. Feel free to ask questions at any time. And this is a kind of a clear topic, sort of in some ways, but actually a very murky topic. And people in the field, professionals, talk as if they know what the word dissociation means and they know what the word psychosis means. But in fact, nobody does. They're very slippery, unclear terms. Psychosis for sure. Dissociation is often used in a kind of confused, murky, unclear way. So let's start with the definition of dissociation then. Because the definition of psychosis is you're psychotic. What's the difference of being psychotic? You're suffering from psychosis. They're all sort of circular definitions. So it means being out of touch with reality. Okay, but you can be out of touch with reality because you're stoned. That doesn't mean you're psychotic. Delusional thinking. Well, okay, but what if you have the delusion that there's a whole bunch of people living inside your body? So why is that not a delusion and a symptom of psychosis? Well, because it's not psychosis, it's dissociation. Okay, but what's the difference between psychosis and dissociation then? Kind of around and around it goes. It's very unclear. And if you look in the back of the DSM, the definitions of psychosis and delusion are not all that crystal clear. But dissociation is relatively easy to clear up. As long as you realize that dissociation doesn't have just one meaning. So people use the word dissociation, but they can mean any one of these four things. So the first meaning of the word dissociation is it's a general systems kind of meaning. It's just the opposite of association. So when things are dissociated, they're disconnected, they're out of relationship with each other, they're not interacting. So then it's just a general term. And there's dissociation constants in chemistry. Dissociation is a word in the English language that's used for disconnection, basically. So that's nothing to do with dissociative disorders, that's just a general meaning of dissociation. And some people say disassociated, which is actually not a correct word. It's a common mispronunciation, so it's dissociation. And the second meaning is that dissociation is a technical term in cognitive psychology. And so there's all these experiments done with all kinds of different animals, human beings, looking at dissociations or disconnections between different brain subsystems. So that's a specific technical definition, which again doesn't have anything to do with dissociative disorders. So you can have an experiment which demonstrates dissociation in a lab rat, for instance. The third meaning of dissociation is a phenomenological meaning. It's the symptoms in the measures of dissociation. So when you have anxiety, what's anxiety? It's the same problem. Anxiety means being anxious. Well, how do you know somebody's anxious? Because they're experiencing anxiety. What is anxiety? Well, it's a state of worry, fearfulness, hyperarousal. So all these definitions are not that crystal clear. And they all come back to what we generally know about the word anxious, or the word anxiety. So you're dissociated because you have the symptoms that are in the measures of dissociation. So it's a symptom definition. And the following list of symptoms equals dissociation. The following list of symptoms equals anxiety. The following list of symptoms equals depression. So how is depression defined in the DSM? Well, there's symptom 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the list. That's it. It's just lists of symptoms, which are a combination of how you feel, what you experience, and the behaviors that you're doing. No different, anxiety, depression, psychosis, dissociation. It's the symptoms on the checklist or the measures or in the diagnostic criteria. Then the fourth meaning of dissociation is kind of a theoretical, intrapsychic defense mechanism meaning of dissociation. That dissociation is something that goes on in your mind. And then therapists will talk about dissociative processes, which you can't actually get your hands on and measure scientifically. And the funny thing is that the outcome of these four meanings of dissociation is that dissociation is only one possible cause of dissociation, which is like totally confusing, but actually kind of clear in a way. Because you can have the symptom of dissociation due to a medication, due to a head injury, due to fear, due to any number of different things can cause the symptom of dissociation. The internal defense mechanism of dissociation is only one of the many possible causes of a symptom of dissociation. So you can see how easily this can get confusing when one person says dissociation, they're thinking and talking about the defense mechanism, another person means the symptom, another person means something that nobody else has ever thought of or heard of. So it's important to say, what is it that you're talking about here? So what I'm talking about mostly when I go through these slides is the symptoms of dissociation. And then you could say, well, how come this one's on the list and that one's not on the list? But I'm going to ignore that for the moment. And psychosis, we're just stuck with, it's not that clear. So in the mental health field, and in our culture, and in my training, this is the way it's set up. Schizophrenia is a genetic brain disease treated with medication. And if you can go to like NAMI or schizophrenia information websites, it's easy to go around on the internet and find a discussion of what schizophrenia is and what it isn't, and frequently they'll say it's not split personality. This idea that schizophrenia equals split personality is just some confusion that's out there somewhere, but we, the mental health professionals or the people at the organization, know that this is not true. They're completely separate things. And the discussion cleared up that one. Next statement likely is going to be, schizophrenia is not caused by bad parenting. So again, that exact statement appears on many of these websites, appears in the literature. Schizophrenia is not caused by bad parenting. And the psychiatrists who believe this will say that this is part of getting rid of the stigma of mental illness. That if we can explain that these are just illnesses, brain diseases, no different from diabetes, cancer, lung disease, then all this stigma will go away. Which totally makes sense because leprosy carries no stigma whatsoever. It doesn't even make sense. Was there a problem with stigma about AIDS in the 1990s? So there's all kinds of stigma about all kinds of physical illnesses. So even if schizophrenia was a physical illness, even if we had proved that, that by itself wouldn't necessarily take away the stigma. And DID is a reaction to the environment. So it's not a genetic brain disease, it's a reaction to the environment. And depending on whether you're a believer or not believer, it's caused by bad therapy. So the person without DID, who's a little hysterical and suggestible, goes to the therapist says, by the way, were you abused by your dad, and did you create a part to remember that? And the person goes, oh yeah. All of a sudden they have DID that they didn't have before. That's basically the model. Not any more fancy or complicated than that. That is the model. And you can go online and go on YouTube and watch Paul McHugh, who's former chairman of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, lead psychiatrist in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, say exactly that. 100% of cases are caused by bad therapy with suggestible clients. Then if you go to some other people, they'll say it's something that happens in the environment, and what happens in the environment is not bad therapy, it's childhood trauma. So the thing is that both these camps agree that it's not a genetic brain disease, it's a reaction to the environment. And then the therapy is not medications, but either psychotherapy for DID, where you just kind of act pleasant and ignore it and don't reinforce it and it'll go away. So again, the intervention is all psychosocial environmental. So that's the model. Genetic brain disease meds, environmental reaction treated with no psychotherapy or psychotherapy. And never the twain shall meet. There's these two separate categories. That's the way it's set up in the mental health field. And when I was in my training and up to the present, I was taught, and everybody knew, everybody in psychiatry, that schizophrenia is a genetic brain disease. This is something that people knew. Nobody debated it. There was no professor going, well, I don't think so, or here's an alternative theory. It was just known by everybody. And in our culture, everybody knows that schizophrenia is a genetic brain disease. And the top guy in schizophrenia genetics, who's also done genetics of panic disorder, eating disorders, and some other things, is this guy, Kenneth Kendler. Very kindly looking guy. There's this fun organization called the American College of Psychiatrists that has an annual meeting that I go to. Every year there's a Dean Award lecture. So the Dean Award is for lifetime research on schizophrenia. So this year, 98, he's getting his award for his lifetime research on the genetics of schizophrenia. This is why this is a fun conference, because the title of the talk is The Genetics of Schizophrenia Toward the Identification of Individual Susceptibility Loci. Kind of a snappy title, catches your interest, right? So this is the top expert in schizophrenia genetics, giving a lecture where he says most, if not all, the reason why schizophrenia runs in families is due to shared genes and not shared environment. Most, if not all, of the cause of schizophrenia is genetic. That's his conclusion. This is the conclusion I was taught that all psychiatrists know to be true. So if you want to find out if this is true, what kind of research do you do in psychiatry genetics or any kind of genetics? Well, one thing, there's several different types of research, but the sort of starting point is twin studies. So if, no, I know you, anybody with a PhD in genetics here? Okay, darn. Well, let's see if you can answer the question. Okay, if you're identifying identical twins, and you interview the first identical twin, and the first identical twin is Chinese, how often is the other identical twin Chinese? Hey, you guys are pretty good, 100% of the time, right? So why? Well, because being Chinese is totally genetic. If you interview the first identical twin, and the first identical twin speaks Chinese, how often does the other identical twin speak Chinese? Pretty much 100%, right? Yeah, so this is called the concordance. When the first twin has a certain trait or a certain disease or a certain characteristic, how often does the other twin have it? That's the concordance rate. And it can be expressed as a decimal or a percentage. So when you study gender, so the first twin is female, second twin is female for identical twins, then you know the concordance is 100%. But how do you figure out if that's being caused by the genes or the environment? You know, just like she said, Yoko's your name, right? You have to do an adoption study. So what happens when you do an adoption study? Okay, here's these two twins. At birth, they're both Chinese. One is kept in a Chinese-speaking family, and the other one's adopted into an English-speaking family. What happens? Amazingly, this one speaks Chinese, this one speaks English, this one speaks Chinese, but this one doesn't become white. She stays Chinese. So now we know, okay, being Chinese is completely controlled by your genes. Speaking Chinese is completely controlled by the environment. That's how we sort it out. So if you do the first pass on your studies, and concordance is 100%, you don't know for a fact that that means it's genetic. You just know it could be. It could also be totally environmental. You can't tell. You've got to do the adoption study. But the flip opposite is an important thing. If the concordance is very, very low, like 10% or 20%, then you know it's not totally genetic. Because if it was totally genetic, concordance would be 100%. So that's what we're really doing with these first round of the twin studies, is we're looking to see, okay, this could be totally genetic. Let's do the next study and find out if that's true or not. Flip opposite, if the concordance is very, very low, then you know it's not genetic and you don't have to do any more research with it. That's the way this operates. So, most, if not all, the reason why schizophrenia runs in families is due to shared genes and not shared environment. Okay, so if most, if not all, the cause of schizophrenia is genetic, what kind of concordance do we require to reach that conclusion? So 100%. We wouldn't know for sure, but we could certainly say, well, yeah, it looks like it's all genetic. What about if concordance was 90%? Mostly, if not all, okay. 80%? Still mostly, if not all. 60%? technically that's just over 50%. It's still mostly, but we're getting kind of far away from, if not all. So he did this study. This is in the same talk. He's presenting his data. 16,000 pairs of twins. And he's studying them for concordance and schizophrenia. And he's concluding that schizophrenia is mostly, if not all, genetic. So what was his concordance rate? These are the actual facts. Basically, 70% of the time, when the first twin has schizophrenia, the other twin does not have it. MZ means monozygotic, which is identical. DZ is non-identical dizygotic twins. So what the data prove, they're sitting right here, that are published, and there's lots and lots of studies that basically average out in this ballpark, done in large numbers of people in many different countries of the world. When the first twin has schizophrenia, identical twin, the other twin does not have it 70% or more of the time. So that's all the information you need to conclude with total medical scientific certainty that schizophrenia is at most only a little bit genetic and is mostly being caused by the environment. And these facts have been in the literature for decades and decades and decades. So the facts that are in the literature disprove what all psychiatrists know, which is mostly, if not all, genetic. Schizophrenia is a genetic brain disease, not caused by bad parenting. It's not your fault. Take your meds, you'll be okay. It's completely unscientific. Not only is it unscientific, it's anti-scientific. You have to actively ignore the data to reach the conclusion that all psychiatrists know. Go ahead.
I read some studies, I don't know, 30 years ago, and I believe they were from Denmark, where they showed a whole lot of the...
So Danish adoption studies are famous, yeah.
Yeah, when they were looking at birth trauma and shutting off
oh, okay, that's different.
on other kids. And they found that needed to happen for almost every case of schizophrenia and also maybe not such good genetic.
Right. So that's a good point about birth trauma. So when you go to the mainstream biological psychiatry schizophrenia literature, nobody says it's 100% coming from the genes. That's just getting too carried away. So the whole environment's got a little bit to do with it, but not that much. So then in the mainstream schizophrenia literature, what are the things from the environment that are allowed to cause or influence schizophrenia? Birth trauma, infections during pregnancy, and maybe the birth season. Because the birth season is going to affect the odds of your mother having a serious flu or other infection during the pregnancy. That's it. That's all that gets mentioned. That's all that's allowed in. Childhood trauma cannot even be mentioned. Now, in the last 5 years, we're just starting to chew away at that and get some trauma research into schizophrenia. But this is the way it's been in the field. So I presented a whole bunch of these slides that I'm going to show you at a conference where a lead schizophrenia researcher was sitting in the front row waiting for her chance to talk. And actually went into it in more detail than I'm going to this afternoon. And she was completely unconvinced and unpersuaded by anything that I had to say. Did not change her opinion at all. And walked away saying it's a genetic brain disease. This is what the field does. So getting this paradigm to shift is a many decades long, painful process. But, sorry, you wanted to say something?
It's a question about the placenta, because
Placenta?
for identical twins, they probably don't share a placenta, they should have each have one placenta. And so placenta is very important.
That's actually an interesting thing in the literature. So if you're non-identical twins, you have 2 amniotic sacs, 1 for each. I mean, it doesn't really matter if you have 2 placentas, sort of, kind of, because they're both attached to the mother, and both are getting nutrients from the mother. But there's actual data for identical twins, they can either have 1 sac or 2 sacs. The concordance rate for schizophrenia is higher in twins who had 1 sac than twins who had 2 sacs, clearly pointing to something happened from the environment during the pregnancy. There is data on that. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Okay, cool. So there's some studies about pregnancies with 2 placentas, and the 2 placentas don't exactly filter and behave the same and don't have the same levels of cortisol and other things, which then could affect the risk for schizophrenia. So I don't know that literature, but that's very interesting. But it's totally consistent with the theme of you're not just genetically doomed to have schizophrenia. Something has to happen from the environment. So before I go through the next set of slides, since I have attention deficit disorder, I'm not going to start talking about breast cancer. Complete change of topic. Now, having breast cancer doesn't require DSM criteria, right? I mean, it's a hardcore biological, under the microscope, diagnosed thing. And we all know that there's lots of research on the genetics of breast cancer. And we know that the BRCA gene, BR, breast, CA, cancer, which is pronounced the BRCA gene. The BRCA gene, of which there's variant 1 and 2, if you have the abnormal BRCA gene, your risk for breast cancer goes way up, which is why Angelina Jolie got bilateral mastectomies when she had no breast cancer yet, because she was BRCA positive and she knew her risk was high, which you might agree or not agree with that decision, but it was factually true. So it's simply a scientific fact that if you have the BRCA mutation, your risk for breast cancer is way up. So it's a genetic illness. End of discussion. So where's all the money going in breast cancer research? Huge, 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 huge majority of the funding is going to studying genes in the isolation from the environment. So you're not looking at the gene and the interaction with the environment. You're just in your lab looking at genes and counting them and measuring them and doing things. That's where all the money and all the research is. And Susan G. Komen Foundation totally bought into that. The woman who first showed the link between breast cancer and the BRCA mutation is Marie Claire King, who published a paper in the journal called Science, which is top journal, in 2003. And the information I'm going to give you is in the abstract of the paper. It's not buried way down there somewhere. So in the abstract of the paper, she says, we studied, I think it was 1,008, it was just over 1,000 Ashkenazi Jewish women in Brooklyn. So it was a very narrow sample, and that's been replicated all over the place with all kinds of other samples since. And Ashkenazi Jewish women have a higher risk of carrying the BRCA mutation than most women. Only 15% of all breast cancers have any identified genetic mutation going along with them, period. But if you do have the mutation, your risk goes up, and the BRCA one carries the greatest increase in risk. So these are all facts. But what does it say in the abstract in this paper by Marie Claire King? It says, we divided the sample into people born before 1940 and people born after 1940. They all have the same genetic mutation. If you're born after 1940, your risk of developing breast cancer by age 50 is 67%. If you're born before 1940, you have the same mutation, your risk is 23%. Something has happened in the environment in the 20th century to make the risk go up by more than double. Now, if we go backwards in time, which we can't actually do, to 1900 or 1850 or something, maybe the risk of having breast cancer with the BRCA gene was no different from normal, or was like a few percent higher. We don't know. But we know that it jumped from 24 to 67% in Brooklyn in the 20th century. This can only be due to something in the environment. There's no other possibility. There's no way that the genes change that much in that short a time. So therefore, we know that the BRCA gene by itself does not, quotes, cause breast cancer. It increases your risk of reacting to something coming in from the environment by getting breast cancer. But if the thing doesn't come in from the environment, your risk is low. The gene by itself does not confer that much risk. What does the BRCA gene do? The actual function of the normal BRCA gene is to repair damage to DNA. So it's really a DNA damage repair gene. So if you've got some, like Agent Orange or something, coming in from the environment, and you've got a normal BRCA gene, and you get damage to your DNA from the Agent Orange, the BRCA gene can fix it, and you don't get cancer. But if your BRCA gene is abnormal, it's mutated, it's not doing its job, then when something comes in from the environment and damages the DNA, you can't fix it and you get cancer. This is what's going on. There's no other possibility scientifically. So that's published in the top journal. It's the first person who shows the relationship between cancer and the BRCA gene, and then that gets totally ignored, not talked about, not researched, and not funded. So it's not that we shouldn't be doing any genetic research. It's not that genes have nothing to do with it. It's where's the balance here? How much money should we be putting into trying to figure out what are these things, 1 thing, 2 things, 5 things, 10 things in the environment that are coming in and ramping up the risk in these BRCA positive people? So this is in cancer. It's exactly the same logic in psychiatry. All the funding, all the promotions, all the hype is the genetics, the genetics, the genetics, the genetics. But we know from these twin data, most of the cause of schizophrenia has to be coming from the environment. And when we look at the research that's going into birth injury, infections during pregnancy, those researchers only claim that's accounting for like 1 or 2% of the risk. All the rest of the risk is something we don't know. So I wonder what that could be. Maybe it's the wrong toothpaste. How about watching the wrong cartoons on TV? Oh. Gee, I wonder if it could be being frightened, terrorized, traumatized, sexually abused, violated, and neglected year in and year out by your parents. I wonder if that could cause somebody to go crazy. That idea is not even allowed by mainstream psychiatry. And
in England now.
you know, England is getting ahead of the curve here, yeah.
Paul Miller.
I know Paul Miller, yeah, he's a cool guy. So in the last 5 years, we're starting to chew away at this. Schizophrenia is genetic brain disease, end of discussion. Bad parenting has nothing to do with it. Trauma has nothing to do with it. The evidence is actually starting to mount. So this is actually starting to look a little bit hopeful just in the last 5 years. But it's much more in Britain and much less in the United States. The institutional resistance in the United States, gigantic. So now, what is the difference between schizophrenia and DID anyway? Well, here's a classical book. What disorder do you think this author is describing? He's describing typical patients. The delusion of being possessed is very commonly seen as a specific type of double personality. Single emotionally charged ideas or drives attain a certain degree of autonomy so that the personality falls to pieces. These fragments can exist side by side and alternately dominate the main part of the personality, the conscious part of the patient. However, the patient may also become a definitely different person from a certain moment onwards. I know I'm holding you in suspense here, but hold on. Naturally, such patients must speak of themselves in one of their 2 versions, or they may speak in the 3rd person of the other 2. Usually he designates himself by one of his several names. The splitting of the psyche into several souls always leads to the greatest inconsistencies. In a few cases, the other personality is marked by use of different speech and voice. Thus, we have here 2 different personalities operating side by side. When specific persons speak through the patients in various cases of automatic speech, each person has his own special voice and distinct manner of speech. Thus, the patient appears to be split into as many different persons or personalities as they have complexes. The blocking of complexes was a early 20th century term in the field that was used a lot. The blocking of the recall of memories is a common occurrence during the examination of these patients. Okay, so here's the quiz question. What disorder is being described here? Yeah, right down the middle of the pipe, clear classical DID and nothing else. Okay, so in the Pacific Northwest, native culture, there was a trickster god. And the trickster god used to play all kinds of pranks on the people. So the trickster god told me to put this slide in. These are descriptions of schizophrenic patients in the book written by Eugen Bleuler, published in 1911, who coined the term schizophrenia. And schizophrenia means split mind. And Bloiler said splitting is the fundamental mechanism of this disease. And splitting can be all kinds of different things in the brain, all identity, emotions, thoughts, will, physical arousal. It happens pervasively in the brain. And he said, by splitting, I mean the same thing as Pierre Janet means by dissociation. But psychiatrists who say that schizophrenia is a genetic brain disease, completely different from split personality, not caused by bad parenting, haven't read Bloiler. They literally have no idea that many of Bloiler's cases were clearly classical DID cases, all lumped in the category of schizophrenia. The problem, so Bloiler couldn't tell the difference. Neither can most psychiatrists. Most psychiatrists are completely unable to tell if somebody has DID or schizophrenia, which is not a problem because nobody has DID anyway, right? So it's almost like I don't even know what to say. It's so overwhelming and preposterous. It's like the cognitive errors I talked about yesterday. So now I'm going to go into some of my own research, trying to sort out this psychosis dissociation thing. And the conclusion is going to be they're different, but it's a confusing mess and they're all the same anyway, and who knows which end is up. It's kind of going to be the conclusion here. So I'm trying to kind of take these two rigid categories, destroy the wall between them, mush them all together, and everybody goes, this is confusing, I don't really know what's going on here, and then we can start sorting it out. That's my basic goal in the profession. So this is a general population survey in Canada where people actually knocked on doors and interviewed people in their homes with this standardized interview. And lo and behold, you could divide the people into 397 people who had no positive symptoms of psychosis, which are Schneiderian symptoms named after Kurt Schneider, who listed them out. There's 11 of them. So this is hardcore schizophrenia psychotic symptoms. So people in the general population in their homes who've had 3 or more of those symptoms versus people who've had none. And I got rid of the 1 or 2 symptoms people just to get a clear differentiation here. And lo and behold, if you're in the general population, if you had 3 psychotic symptoms or more, your rate of physical or sexual abuse or both is 8%, whereas if you've had 3 or more symptoms, it's 45%. Okay, so does that make us consider the possibility that maybe childhood trauma might have something to do with psychosis? Maybe it's not that you're genetically doomed to have psychosis. Maybe you're somehow biologically predisposed to have psychosis, but if you don't have the childhood trauma, then things stay quiet.
Now, did those 3 or more symptoms coincide with symptoms of DID or dissociation? And so did they actually have symptoms of psychosis, or did they have symptoms of dissociation?
Okay, so now she's asking the $60,000 question. So these psychotic symptoms, are they really psychotic symptoms or dissociative symptoms, and what's the difference, and how do you know? Which I'm answering by saying, you're asking me?
Yeah.
Well, this is the confusion that we're going to go through for the rest of the time here. So same study. Okay, so the people with 3 or more symptoms, they score almost twice as high on the DES, Dissociative Experiences Scale. They have twice as many psychosomatic symptoms. They have 3 times as many secondary features of DID, which is a bunch of DID symptoms. The DES is kind of general dissociation symptoms. Secondary features of DID is specific, like coming to a place you don't know how you got there, being told by people about things you can't remember, finding samples of different handwriting. They're 5 times as borderline, and they have more than twice as many ESP paranormal experiences. So if you're out there in the general population, you're going to report a lot more childhood physical and sexual abuse, and you're going to report a lot more of all kinds of different symptoms, including dissociative symptoms. What if you're in the mental health system with a stable long-term diagnosis of schizophrenia? So I interviewed this is again in Canada, people who've been in the mental health system with stable schizophrenia diagnosis for quite a long time, with the same standardized interview. And this is not like advanced rocket science, right? All I do is So all you guys have chronic long-term schizophrenia diagnoses. And I just go, okay, everybody who was sexually abused or physically abused as a child, sit over there. Everybody who was not physically or sexually abused, sit over there. And here's how those two groups are going to differ. If you're schizophrenic and you report abuse, you got much higher DS scores. Skip that line. You got more somatic symptoms, more secondary features of DID, more borderline, more SP paranormal, more amnesia items. So you've got a lot more of a bunch of different symptoms, including your more dissociative. But wait a minute, Schneiderian symptoms. Those are called Schneiderian first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia. Those are the core symptoms of schizophrenia. So an abused schizophrenic has almost twice as many symptoms of schizophrenia as a non-abused schizophrenic. Isn't that weird? Same groups now. It's a different standardized interview now. And these are various classical psychotic symptoms. Ideas of references like the person on the TV is talking specifically to me, or the FBI has put a message on the side of the bus which is delivered directly to me. Voices commenting on what's going on. Paranoid ideation, thought insertion where thoughts are being stuck in your mind. Visual hallucinations, reading somebody else's mind, all much more common in the abused than the non-abused schizophrenic. And so this is a scale called the positive and negative syndrome scale, same two groups. The positive symptoms are things that you have that you're not supposed to have, like agitations, hallucinations, scrambled up thinking. The negative symptoms are things that you're missing. So those are the kind of nobody home, burned out, empty, no willpower, no pep, no energy, no life. It's like you're just talking to an empty shell. Those are the negative symptoms. And then the composite score is just you add the two together. Lo and behold, the abused schizophrenics got more positive symptoms, fewer negative symptoms, and when you add the two together, they differ significantly statistically. So the abused schizophrenic has got a different schizophrenia profile from the non-abused schizophrenic. And this positive versus negative symptoms has got a lot to do with whether you're going to respond to medications or not. It's not just a little theory thing. Okay, now I've took a series of my own cases of MPD. This is up to over 300 or something now in the more recent papers. And 83 people with schizophrenia. All got the same standardized interview. So they're not matched. They have different age, different genders, different percent of married, all that stuff. So it's not a perfect study. But let's look at MPD compared to schizophrenia. Okay, so the MPD equals DID people have twice the abuse rates, but the schizophrenics, still half of them are reporting physical and sexual abuse. Carrying on, the duration of the physical abuse, that's in years. Number of abusers, duration of sexual abuse in years. So the severity of the abuse is much greater in DID than schizophrenia. But it's not a different category, it's just more of the same category. How about dissociative disorders? Now this is according to the structured interview. So you'll see that there's 166 people with clinical diagnosis of MPD, of whom the structured interview says 94.6% have MPD. That's because no structured interview is perfect and no structured interview picks up everybody. But so that's good. Almost everybody has MPD clinically and on the structured interview. But look at the people with schizophrenia. A quarter of them come up meeting criteria for multiple personality disorder. And also they have the other dissociative disorders. So the DID people have more psychosomatic symptoms, about the same level of substance abuse, more depression, more borderline. But again, it's not like the schizophrenia column's all zeros. It's just the same thing to a greater degree in DID. What do the DID people have to a greater degree? They have more dissociation and more schizophrenia. Because the symptoms used to define schizophrenia, the DID people have more than the people with schizophrenia. So how does this make any sense? It doesn't have to make sense because it's psychiatry. So just more things. The DID people have more trance states, imaginary playmates, sleepwalking, all of which are dissociative in nature. They score much higher on the DS, much higher on the somatic symptoms. They have more symptoms of schizophrenia, more secondary features, more borderline, more SP. Same pattern, just going on and on and on and on. Okay, so here's two large series of, this is back in the MPD era, so this is all MPD patients. So series 1, there's 236 people with MPD. Series 2, there's 102 people with MPD. It's just two different studies. Previous diagnoses of schizophrenia, treatment with antipsychotic medications, and treatment with ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. So these are people who are in treatment for MPD. And somebody's looked at them clinically and figured out, okay, this person has MPD, and if we give them the structured interview, 94% of the time the structured interview will agree. They'll have high scores on the DES, etc. What have the previous clinicians thought about these people? They haven't thought this is a bunch of hysterical women that we can easily put over in the dead zone over there and spend our time with the schizophrenics who have genetic brain diseases. That's not what they've done. They've gone, half the time, these people have a genetic brain disease called schizophrenia. Half the time, or quarter to half the time they've said these people need antipsychotic medications because they're psychotic. And 1 in 10, 1 in 6, 1 in 10, somewhere in that range of those people, the physician has gone, these people are so treatment refractory, so seriously mentally ill that they need ECT. So the clinicians clearly think that these people with this neurotic reaction to the environment that just goes away if you ignore it, are so profoundly mentally ill that they need the heaviest duty interventions those guys have. So most psychiatrists can't tell the difference between this light neurotic disorder that goes away if you ignore it and the genetic brain disease, which is not even a genetic brain disease anyway. And so now we've got 108 people with DID, and we've got, this is using the PANS again, the positive and negative syndrome scale that has the positive symptoms and the negative symptoms. The 240 is the norms for schizophrenia in the manual for the PANS, and the 108 is people that we gave the PANS to ourselves. So on one of the, there's two core measures in the literature, the BPRS and the PANS, used to study schizophrenia. So we took one of them, the PANS. Lo and behold, people with DID have more positive symptoms than people with schizophrenia, and they have fewer negative symptoms. So different measures, different sample, same pattern, over and over and over. And there's no research showing that this pattern doesn't hold. It's just every time somebody does a study, same pattern. Now this is a really bizarre study. So I published this in the 90s. So there's 12 series of schizophrenics from the literature. So this is schizophrenia specialists have diagnosed people as having schizophrenia and hearing voices and having Schneiderian symptoms. Hardcore definition of schizophrenia is based on those symptoms. So these Schneiderian symptoms, so the funny thing is this guy Kurt Schneider in the 50s said, here's 11 symptoms. Voices talking to each other, commenting each other's behavior, commenting on the person's behavior, thoughts stuck in your mind, thoughts taken out of your mind, delusions, somebody else's thoughts out loud inside your head, thought broadcasting where other people can hear your thoughts, having your thoughts, your feelings, or your actions controlled by some power or force outside you. Those are the Schneiderian symptoms. So, I mean, that's psychosis. So all these series, this is the number of people in each publication. There's 12 different publications. That's the number of people with schizophrenia. And that's the percentage who had any Schneiderian symptoms. One or more. So there's a lot of people in these studies who don't have schizophrenia, but they don't have any symptoms of schizophrenia. So the total, when you add all the studies up, is 2,576. And almost half the people had no Schneiderian first-rank symptoms of schizophrenia at all. How weird is that? Well, how about the 3 series of DID cases, totaling 368? 87% had one or more Schneiderian symptoms. Yet again, demonstrating that these so-called psychosis symptoms are more common in DID than in schizophrenia, which totally makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, so go ahead.
What about like the thought language and communication symptoms of schizophrenia? Did you ever look at that in DID patients?
Which symptoms again, sorry?
Thought language and communication symptoms like allergia, all that, all those others.
Well, broadly speaking, thought, language, and communication in the most general sense, this is all based on thought, language, and communication because it's asking questions and getting answers, right? But I know what you mean, so I'm just making. So this is one of the things that probably could tell the difference. So what do people who seem like they actually have schizophrenia, if you know how to diagnose DID and you're trying to take out the DID people? So I've got a whole book about this, going into all these research predictions. But basically, if you look back in Bloyler's textbook, there's these people who are just pure, obvious DID. But then there's people who, oh, by the way, the clarion frequency of the water here is probably slumber J4 because, that's the way I think the Cowboys might win tomorrow. Okay, so that's thought disorder, right?
Yeah.
That's all jumbled up. You can't follow it. It doesn't make sense. There's all these words stuck in there. You don't even know what the word is. Very, 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 very rarely do DID people ever talk like that. And if they do, it's very short, limited. It's some sort of like total overwhelm with fear, rapid switching thing that settles down. Whereas there's people with schizophrenia who talk like that for years. So that's a difference. And that's starting to tap into this. There's something wrong with the cognitive machinery of the brain here. So that would be something that is going to differentiate people who probably have schizophrenia and probably don't have DID, just for a starter. Then you're going to look at the trauma histories. So do people with that form really thought disordered and heavy negative symptom schizophrenia? So DID people have fewer negative symptoms. The heavy negative symptom schizophrenia people with those kind of thought disorder symptoms, do they have more or less trauma? So this becomes a research question. And the prediction is, I have a thing called the dissociative subtype of schizophrenia, which is kind of a mix in the middle of DID schizophrenia. So you start out at non-dissociative schizophrenia, schizo-dissociative disorder, or dissociative subtype of schizophrenia, and classical DID. So when you go from this end to this end, starting over here you have less trauma, lower rate of auditory hallucinations, much lower rate of voices talking to each other and commenting on the person's behavior. You have more negative symptoms, fewer positive symptoms, less childhood trauma, less comorbid other diagnoses, less psychobiology of trauma, which has to do with cortisol and hippocampus and all kinds of things. So there's a whole list of these things. Lower hypnotizability, whereas if you go over to this end, towards the DID end, you're getting more childhood trauma, more comorbidity, more auditory hallucinations, more frequently the voices can talk to each other, more psychobiology of trauma, less negative symptoms, less thought disorder. So this could all be sorted out, which is my long-winded answer to your question. But the problem is, clinically, this doesn't get sorted out. Everybody's just getting thrown in this mishmash hopper of schizophrenia, and DID is not getting recognized. So what difference does that make to treatment? Well, over in England, who was it who mentioned England? You, yeah. So in England, they're way ahead of the curve. They're doing big general population studies, looking at rates of childhood trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, bullying, other things, and seeing that the risk for schizophrenia and psychosis goes way, 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 way up. Not like 1.5 times if you have that kind of childhood trauma. And they're not quite at the trauma therapy for schizophrenia stage yet, but they'll get there.
There's a book.
And there's books coming out now for cognitive therapy of schizophrenia. Paul Miller, who I know is a great guy, who's an EMDR guy, he'll be at the forefront of trauma therapy for schizophrenia for sure.
It's coming out.
Good.
You can get it on, you can order it on Amazon.
Okay.
Pre-order.
So Paul Miller, who's in Ireland, right? He's a psychiatrist who comes to EMDR conferences, who understands trauma, dissociation, psychosis. So this is like cutting edge emerging. And so check back in 20 years, mainstream psychiatrists might be going, oh yeah, now we've determined that trauma's got quite a lot to do with it. We have to consider dissociative disorders. But in North America, it's in the mainstream schizophrenia field, the littlest crack has opened up, that's all.
So what I'm seeing here, what I'm getting is, or what I'm putting together is people, that Bluler guy or who we were talking about in the 1900s?
Bloiler.
Yeah, that guy.
Bloiler from the boiler, that's how you remember it.
So he basically labeled DID as schizophrenia,
Right.
I would say.
And he invented the term schizophrenia.
Exactly. And so what he did was do that, brainwash the psychiatrists to believe that that's what schizophrenia is, and they won't give up that for the life of them, when actually schizophrenia could be on the upper end of the continuum and actually be, here's DID, here's schizophrenia, or they're together, and it's just a different adaptive way. Instead of dissociating, they adapt differently to the trauma.
Except a lot of their so-called psychosis is the same as dissociation.
That's what I'm saying.
Right.
They're on the same continuum.
So what I figure is the problem now is, like, according to, well, schizophrenia is just a word.
Yeah, I know. So
It's-
it could be something that's above, but on the same dissociative scale, they just adapt differently.
Exactly, that's basically what I'm saying, but not 100% of the time. So I think that another issue is, in this category of schizophrenia, we've just thrown in all kinds of people. We've thrown in obvious DID cases. We've thrown in kind of in the middle, confusing, dissociative subtype of schizophrenia. We've thrown in negative symptom thought disorder predominant schizophrenia. Then we do drug studies where we throw drugs at all these people, and lo and behold, the drugs don't seem to work that well. And then we do a bunch of genetic studies, and we can't find anything consistent there because we got this hodgepodge of all kinds of different people. So if we take out the clear DID people, then we take out, maybe we take out the dissociative schizophrenia people, or we leave them in but analyze them separately. And then we have the clear non-dissociative schizophrenia people. Now we might be able to start sorting things out. We'll find that the non-dissociative schizophrenia people don't respond to antipsychotics as well as the dissociative schizophrenia people. So this would be good for the drug companies. So this is not like anti-drug company. The drug companies are wasting literally billions of dollars trying to study all these people who aren't in the same category. They just got the same label stamped on them. So I think there's going to be a subgroup of people in there who are just kind of genetic predominant schizophrenia people, maybe. But then you have to look at these negative symptoms. Okay, you're sort of empty, you're withdrawn, you don't bond, you don't connect. Does that sound like an attachment problem? What kind of parents did they have? That could be the profound neglect cases, where the negative symptoms of schizophrenia are actually the positive symptoms of neglect. And the positive symptoms of schizophrenia are actually the positive symptoms of active abuse. So then when we sort out the extreme neglect people with schizophrenia, we're going to be getting down to a fairly small number of people here. In the mainstream schizophrenia literature, it says negative symptoms can be caused by concurrent depression. Because what do depressed people look like? They're not exactly zippy and interactive. So the depression symptoms, fairly similar to, not clearly different from negative symptoms of psychosis. What if you've been in the back ward hospital for the last 15 years and nobody's visited you? So institutionalization can cause negative symptoms. There's bound to be some medical conditions that can cause negative symptoms. So just saying negative symptoms doesn't put everybody in one category. Then within there, we've got to sort out into subcategories. So it's just a lot more complicated and a lot more trauma-driven than the field is saying right now. And there'll never be just one answer. But let's look at some people with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. So these people were interviewed in 1993 with the SCID, which is a standardized interview for Axis 1 diagnoses, and there's a SCID 2 for Axis 2. In DSM-5, we don't talk about Axis 1, Axis 2 anymore, but it's still all the same disorders. So Axis 2 is basically the personality disorders. So by definition in this study, 36 people in 1993 met criteria for active schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder in the preceding year. Then they're followed up for 2 years, and 2 years later we look at how many have met the criteria in the preceding year. So this is 92, 93, then we look at 94, 95. Lo and behold, look at this. 3/4 of the people no longer meet criteria for schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. And their overall number of active diagnoses on Axis 1 has dropped almost by half, and Axis 2 about 1/3. This is, for schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, incredibly good outcome data. Whoa, so some pretty good medications there. And the it's actually, yeah, it's a typo. It's the MCMI, the Milan Clinical Multi-Axis Inventory. It's got all these scales on it. Thought disorder's gone down, anxiety's gone down, depression's gone down, all these different things have gone down, including thought disorder, so they're less psychotic. On my structured interview, the dissociative disorders interview schedule, the number of Schneiderian symptoms has gone down, somatic, secondary DID, they're less borderline, they have less ESP. Oh, look at that, their PANS positive symptoms have gone down, their negative symptoms have gone down. The PANS, that's the positive and negative syndrome scale that I showed you before with the positive and negative symptoms. Dissociation, DES has gone down, Beck Depression Inventory, Hamilton Depression Scale, and the SCL-90 kind of measures all kinds of stuff, and it's got a psychoticism subscale which has gone down. So 4 different measures of psychosis gone down 1/3 half. So who are these people? These are all people with multiple personality disorder who are being treated in outpatient therapy for 2 years of follow-up after being discharged from my program in Dallas. But they meet DSM structure interview criteria for schizophrenia, schizoaffective. So these people could get into any schizophrenia study, any genetic study, any research program, any drug trial, because they do meet criteria and they do score high on the symptom measures. But if you take these people and call them DID, or maybe don't even worry about what you call them, just give them this kind of psychotherapy. So how many people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia kicking around in the system would respond like this? A bunch, some, maybe a lot. I don't know the exact number, but not 0. If you look at the major drug treatment for schizophrenia studies, like the CATIE study, CATIE, this was a $42 million NIMH-funded study with, I forget the exact numbers, like 1,500 or 1,700 people with schizophrenia. There's dozens of different centers in the United States participating. Bring in all these people with schizophrenia, and it's a very well-designed study. You start on this medication. If you don't respond, you can add this or switch to this. So the study design is great. The diagnostic assessment is great. All the treatment is free. These are all people highly invested, the psychiatrists, highly invested in drugs are the way to go. Schizophrenia is a good diagnosis. So they're highly motivated to treat these people for free. You can't get a better situation, right? Free treatment, highly motivated psychiatrists, very careful monitoring, well-designed scientific study. After 18 months, 74% of the people had dropped out. 50% of those dropped out for intolerable side effects and lack of treatment response. And the rest dropped out for, a bunch of different reasons. So when you give free care using the best that biological psychiatry has to offer, the best trained psychiatrists, 74% of people drop out in a 1.5 years. Well, because they're crazy, right? Maybe because they're making rational decisions as consumers and the product is not worth consuming. Because when you look at the people who stayed in the study, how did they do? If you define remission as symptoms dropping by 40% or more, and you look at all the 1,700, whatever the exact number was, people in the study, after a 1.5 years, under 10% of people were still in the study and still in remission. Over 90% either had disappeared totally or were in the study but still actively psychotic. That's what psychopharmacology and biological psychiatry has to offer. Think we maybe should give that a try? Maybe put a couple 100,000 in there compared to 42 million for a drug study. So this is the state of the nation. So many people with DID have been told that they're psychotic, this is still going on, have been treated with meds and no psychotherapy. It's just not right. It's not the way to do things. So coming back then to what's the difference between dissociation and psychosis? Well, if you look at the PANS, or the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, which is the other common schizophrenia rating scale, and you look at the Dissociative Experiences Scale, they both have questions about hearing voices talking out loud inside your head. It's exactly the same symptom. So how do you know when this is a psychotic voice and this is a dissociative voice? There's no way to know. It's impossible to figure out. You just decide it's dissociative because this person's dissociative. Or you decide it's psychotic because this person's psychotic. So that's called, in logic, that's called a tautology. That's like circular reasoning. It just proves itself. I know this is a dissociative voice because this person has a dissociative disorder. Well, why couldn't this be a dissociative person with one psychotic symptom? Okay, this is a schizophrenic, so they have a psychotic voice, but how do you know they couldn't have a dissociative symptom? So now I'm not talking about the kind of voice where there's this mumbling, grumbling. I'm talking about voices where they speak in sentences and paragraphs, and they're like these little TV commentators. So typical DID style voice. They have attitudes, they say things, they watch, they react, they talk to each other, they have arguments. Some are kind, some are soothing. Are those kind of voices common in schizophrenia? Well, let's go to the authority, the American Psychiatric Association. Let's look in the DSM-3 and the DSM-4. In order to have schizophrenia, what has to be true, according to DSM-3, DSM-4? Well, you have to have some symptoms. That kind of makes sense. It has to last for 6 months or longer. We know it's a chronic illness, so that kind of makes sense. From 1 to 6 months, the label is schizophreniform disorder. From 0 days to 31 days, it's brief psychotic disorder, because you don't want to throw the schizophrenia label on too fast. So schizophrenia, 6 months or longer. So there's the symptoms, duration, and then there's the distress, dysfunction. You have to kind of deteriorate, you have to be stressed out. And then there's exclusion criteria. It can't be due to this disorder or this disorder or this disorder. So basically schizophrenia is symptoms, 6 months or longer, stress, deterioration. That's how it's defined. Then what's the list of symptoms? Well, there's like 4 of them. And so it's voices, delusions, catatonia, disorganized behavior and thinking. But there's a little note, and it actually says it, note, colon, right in the diagnostic criteria. Only one symptom is required if it consists of voices talking to each other or voices keeping up a running commentary on the person's behavior. This is the definition of schizophrenia. Okay, so here's another medical disorder. Cough disorder. So if we had a diagnosis in general medicine called cough disorder, it's diagnosed by the person coughing excessively for a while. How many different causes and diseases would you have lumped in this one category? We'd have lung cancer, we'd have TB, we'd have a brief upper respiratory infection. Yeah, yeah, so that was brief cough disorder. So we can see that if we just defined a disorder by one symptom, how about fever disorder? How many causes of fever disorder would there be? And how many different treatments would there be? And if we just gave one drug or one category of drugs to everybody with fever disorder, how well do we think that would work? And then what will we discover when we did some research? Hold your breath. When people have cough disorder, they often frequently have fever disorder at the same time. This is how the DSM is organized. Schizophrenia is literally only required one symptom. And lo and behold, if you had schizophrenia, you had an increased rate of depression, anxiety, OCD, all kinds of stuff. So we treat these as separate diseases, which makes no sense medically. Now in DSM-5, there's a big, big, big change, because they took out that little note, colon, and they now require 2 symptoms. So now the psychiatry talks like we've really de-emphasized positive Schneiderian symptoms. We've realized that they're not specific. So now we require 2 symptoms. So nobody's ever met somebody with schizophrenia who has one symptom anyway. So it doesn't make any difference. So psychiatry acts like it's backpedaled down from the voices are so specific. kind of a little bit, but not really. So this is why people with DID meet criteria for schizophrenia, and people with schizophrenia meet criteria for DID, because the symptoms don't differentiate, the diagnostic criteria don't differentiate, and then most clinicians can't differentiate. And Bloiler couldn't differentiate. And in my schizophrenia book, I go into, there's a chapter on Bloiler's book. Then there's case histories from the schizophrenia literature. So you can go to the Schizophrenia Bulletin, and they have a personal account section, personal perspective sections, and people will be talking about their battle with schizophrenia. And lo and behold, the voice has a name, has an age, they have a trauma history. It's obviously DID. These cases are easy to find all over the place. So therefore, we have a big confused mess. Now, if I give this presentation to the dissociation experts, one of the responses I get, so if I give it to the schizophrenia experts, it's, nah, these are two separate categories. That's your disease, this is our disease. We don't even have to pay attention to you. But if I give the presentation at the ISSTD, there'll be a bunch of people whose response is, nah, these are two separate categories. We can tell the difference. Those dumbbells over there in the psychosis field can't tell the difference. If we go over there, we'll take some of their patients and put them over in the DID category, and then we'll give them psychotherapy. And these other people have schizophrenia, which is a whole different thing. It's genetic brain disease. And you can't do psychotherapy with those people. Disproven by the cognitive therapy literature that's growing and growing and growing in England. So on both sides, we've got people who think, oh yeah, I can tell the difference. Even if it is true that there's people in the dissociative disorders field who are pretty good at sorting out most cases, and there's certainly lots of people who just need to be rescued from schizophrenia and given DID treatment. Even if a few people in the ISSTD can do that, it's like a very small number of people out of 30,000 psychiatrists in the United States. The other 29,946 can't. So what good is it doing the field to just say we can tell the difference? It's not helping the clientele at all. So my basic goal is, as I said, to get it acknowledged, which is not just me, I mean, it's a whole field of people trying to do this. Try and get it acknowledged by the schizophrenia field that this is a for real, day in, day out, clinical reality problem that needs a lot of attention and research. And just like in breast cancer, if you just study the genes by themselves, you never find anything. You've got to study the genes. Sure, there's some genes involved, but you've got to study the interaction between the environment and the genes. How's the environment turning them on, turning them off, causing mutations? And if you just study the environment, okay, you'll be able to figure some stuff out, but then you're missing the genetic side of it. So the real research is looking at the genes and the interaction with the environment. So you get a bunch of people who've got the risk gene, the BRCA gene. It is in fact a risk gene, but how does it work? What is it doing in there? What is it interacting with to put the risk way up? And what can we do to settle the environment down? Because we can't fix the genes, so far anyway. It's exactly the same model for schizophrenia and all of psychiatric genetics. Okay, so we're okay for time. So let's go to that set of tablets. It's some versions of the tablets are in gold, embossed with titanium. Some are written in stone, and some are just printed on paper. I'm talking about the DSM-5 here. But the word has come down from the American Psychiatric Association, the DSM. So what does the DSM-5 say about genes for psychiatric disorders? What does the National Institute of Mental Health say? If you go to NIMH.org and you look at the top, there's a little blah, 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 and there's a series of buttons. Research domain criteria is one of the main buttons on the NIMH page. So that year to a year and a half ago, somewhere in there, the NIMH, the main funder of mental health research, made a public announcement that in the future they are no longer going to fund psychiatric research tagged to DSM categories because there's nothing to find. They've officially given up. The DSM categories are not separate biological diseases. What they are going to fund is looking at things like fear circuitry, memory systems, arousal systems, but not DSM categories, because all this biology is just all splattered across all these different DSM categories. So that's not my opinion. That's the official opinion of the NIMH. What does the APA say about this? In the DSM-5, it says, well, first of all, a little tiny error of scholarship. So I went over monozygotic identical twins. If you have a high concordance, you can't tell that it's genetic. It could be, but you can't tell for sure. Same thing for the environment. So if you go interview all these kids and they're all Chinese and they're all speaking Chinese, okay, which is caused by genes and which is caused by environment? You can't really tell, right? But look at all these families. They're all Chinese and they're all speaking Chinese. So being Chinese must be genetic and speaking Chinese must be genetic, right? Because it's running in families. If something runs in families, it must be genetic, which we know is not true, which we have lots of data showing. And common sense will show you, okay, being Chinese is running in families, it's genetic. But when you adopt out, the language changes. So just because something runs in families, like speaking English, voting Republican, liking sports, living in the United States, that doesn't prove it's genetic. It could be totally environmental. So something running in families is completely neutral as to whether it's genetic or environmental or 50-50 or what. In the DSM, I forget the number, but I published the number because I counted it up. It's like 27 times or something. There's 27 individual places in DSM-5 where it has the diagnostic criteria. It tells you the name of the disorder. There's some text. There's some discussion. There's the diagnostic criteria. Then there's a section called risk factors. And there's a subsection called genetic and environmental risk factors. For 20-something different disorders, it says, under genetic factors, the evidence that this is genetic is that it runs in families. This is stated over 20 times in the DSM. Running in families is evidence of genetic causation, which is completely scientifically false. It's just wrong. So this is the level of science that's going into the DSM. But if you go around in the DSM, you have to look a bit, but you'll find several statements that there's no genetic specificity or biological specificity to any DSM category. There's no blood test, brain scan, there's nothing that can be used clinically to make diagnoses, tell one from the other. And it'll say in several different sections, several hundred risk genes have been identified. So we used to be looking for the gene for schizophrenia. Finally, they gave up on. Then they're looking for the genes for schizophrenia, which was, we're not sure if they mean 2 or 3 or 5 or 6, but anyway, it was more than one. And then it started to be, well, we're not finding the 4, 5, 6, 7, so it became maybe dozens. This is over the last 30 years, 40 years. Now it's 200 is the official number in the DSM-5. There's several hundred risk genes for schizophrenia. But of course, we're still rolling along. So now publications are coming out where people are talking about thousands of genes. Okay, that's good, thousands of genes. So we got 2,000 genes causing schizophrenia, which only requires 2 symptoms to make the diagnosis. So then each gene would be causing 2 1,000ths of a symptom. Okay, so that's just like you'd have to have a thought disorder to believe that to start with. But let's just keep it at 200. So there's 200 genes. This is the official APA statement. And each of these genes by itself confers 1 to 2% of the risk for the disorder. That's the conclusion, supported by all this research. And it's the same set of several hundred genes for schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, autism, ADHD. They're not different genes. It's the same couple of hundred genes. So again, the official position of American psychiatry is there's no genetic specificity whatsoever. But schizophrenia is still a genetic brain disease. It's just that there's hundreds of risk genes contributing. So what we're going to, so one person could have these 25, and this person could have these 67, and these 41 in this person. So it's all different by different people. So, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend literally billions of dollars over the next 20 years, And we're going to identify each one of these 200 genes. Well, we may find out it's 600, but we'll just focus on these 200 genes. We're going to figure out what these genes do. What protein do they code for? And what is the function of that protein? And then we're going to invent 200 designer drugs. And then we're going to do personalized medicine. So personalized medicine means we're going to study your DNA. That's what it means these days. It doesn't mean being personal. So then we're going to find you've got these 200 risk genes. Or maybe you've only got 100 risk genes that are active. Then each of these genes would be contributing 1/100th of the 2 symptoms. So how does this like all come together biologically, that these 50, 100 different molecules all stream together and cause you to hear a voice? But anyway, don't worry about that part of it. We're going to give you 50 to 100 genetic designer drugs that cost $5,000, $10,000 a month each. And then you're going to be okay. Who'd you say is going to pay for that? Oh, don't talk about that. How many drug-drug interactions? How many side effects? What's the compliance rate going to be? We already know 75% of people drop out when they're taking 1 or 2 meds. Try taking literally 50 to 100 different meds a day. This is where all the money's going. It's impossible to get a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to study dissociative disorders. It's monumentally difficult to study childhood trauma in any kind of way unless it's PTSD. This is kind of the state of the nation. And so that's all I've got to say about that. Go ahead. Well, you have to remember, you don't have to remember, you have to be told what the Colin A. Ross Institute for Psychological Trauma is. It's my office in Richardson, Texas, with me and my secretary. So it's really just my office. And it's a virtual reality entity that has a website. And the Ross Institute contracts with the parent hospital corporation that owns a hospital in Michigan, hospital in Denton, Texas, and hospital in LA. And I manage those trauma programs, consult to, advise, and participate in those trauma programs. So the Ross Institute isn't the hospital and doesn't provide the treatment. But I created the Ross Institute in 1995.
So those hospitals provide treatment under your direction?
Yeah, and they employ the nurses and pharmacy and all that.
How long have you been doing that?
In Texas since 1991.
So all of these years you've been doing proper treatment with success rates?
Right, and I have 6 or 7 treatment outcome studies where I followed people up with standardized measures.
This is good information,
Mm-hmm.
yet how many people out there with some power pay attention to what you're cranking out?
Well, they're cranky, so they don't pay attention to what I crank out. It's monstrously stupid. So I'm actually jumping back to the cancer field. So this is a problem in our whole culture. Now we're getting into alternative complementary medicine. So in effect, childhood trauma, dissociative disorder treatment is like alternative medicine. It's totally marginalized and poo-pooed by regular medicine. So I got interested in, I've published 3 cancer papers in 2015. One of which is the trophoblast model of cancer. And this guy who I talked to actually just suddenly died of a heart attack in July, or a cardiac arrest, whose name is Nicholas Gonzalez, who's an amazing, wonderful guy. The treatment model goes back to the late 19th, early 20th century, where it's a long story, so I'm compressing it down. But this guy figured out that pancreatic enzymes, normal pancreatic enzymes that do digestive work, can be used for the treatment of cancer. And there's a whole scientific foundation and model for this. And so then he treated cancer with pancreatic enzymes, totally disappeared. Funnily enough, a dentist in Dallas-Fort Worth area in the 60s caught wind of this, picked it up, started doing it. And he actually became psychotic, I think, but he ended his practice. And this guy, Nicholas Gonzalez, studied Kelly, met with Kelly, the dentist, picked it up and was doing this kind of practice. So he's got So I've just finished guest editing a special tribute issue to Nicholas Gonzalez, who died in July, with all these contributions talking about what he did. I've published about his model in several different journals, and I'm really sold on this guy because it's very scientific, very specified, very logical. And the thing that really convinced me was he's got one series of 11 cases, another series of 30 cases, but now he and his widow and I are getting together to publish a series of almost 100 of his cases, which is only some of his cases from his whole practice. So he's got dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people with end-stage pancreatic cancer, stage 4 ovarian cancer, metastases to brain, liver, bone, diagnosed MRI, biopsy from mainstream oncologists alive 10 plus years later with no evidence of disease. So what's his reception from mainstream oncology? Same as we've been getting with the MPD field. Marginalized, discredited, attacked, not believed. So the same thing's going on in the cancer establishment. Okay, now everybody's depressed. We're almost at break time. And by the way, there's only 15 minutes for the break, which is really not realistic. So I think I'm going to start back around 3:20-ish.
After quite interesting backup, some people at Norton, I managed to get my ego state book done there, and I mentioned both DID and organized abuse in the book, and it was very interesting. I had to get a different editor than I started
So she's
out.
just saying she was able to get Norton, which is a mainstream publisher, to publish a book talking about ego state therapy, organized abuse. So it's not that it's impossible to get the word out at all.
It was hard, but I did.
It's hard to get the word out at all, but once the word is out, it just hits this wall of silence and neglect. So I always say that if you're a psychiatrist and you choose to work with people who've been abused and neglected, then you get abused and neglected by your colleagues, which is not a coincidence. I mean, this is a structural, systemic thing.
I'm really excited to hear you talking about this because I've done a lot of research with psychiatrists in schizophrenia, and I also just worked on a very acute mental health unit for
Good.
2.5 years, and I noticed that there seemed to be a difference between people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia who had trauma histories, wherein their symptoms seemed to be more related to the trauma than other schizophrenia
Right.
patients. And so I always wondered to myself, but of course nobody's talking about this, well, these patients seem different to me.
Right.
And so I'm wondering.
That's the first intuitive pickup point. These people seem different. That's how I got into it. They seem different.
It's so sad, like 25 to 30% of them are not helped by medication.
Not helped at all. It's basically a kind of a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. A third get either negligible or like tiniest amount of benefit. A third get kind of sort of modest, medium-ish, and a third actually have sort of a reasonable response. But then quite a few people respond to placebo as well. That's the problem. In the main trial that got Seroquel on the market, which was one of the new atypical antipsychotics, 351 people with schizophrenia from 20-something academic centers in the United States. The average score on the brief psychiatric rating scale at the beginning of the study was 47. At the end of the study, it was 38. The cutoff to get into the study was 27. Being a responder to Seroquel was defined as a 40% or greater reduction in BPRS score. But if you start at 47 and you come down 40%, you just are above the cutoff to get back into the study. So that's a very slack definition of responder. Even with that definition of responder, and you have to look at the exclusion criteria for these studies, all these FDA studies. You couldn't get into the study if you had any other active axis 1 disorder, depression, substance abuse. You couldn't be dead. You couldn't be homeless. You couldn't be in jail. You couldn't be so angry at psychiatry that you're not coming. You can't be so disorganized that you're not coming. You've got to come for an outpatient appointment every week for 12 weeks. In that group of people, 29.2% were responders, meaning 40% or greater drop in score. And when you go through the literature, the whole literature is like that. That's how effective these meds are. So which again goes to, okay, if the meds were 100% effective and everybody's getting back to normal and out there working and don't even mention psychotherapy, why bother? But the meds just aren't working because most people don't take them, or they quit, or they have side effects, or they don't work that well for many people. So why aren't we investing in psychotherapy? That's my argument. It's always fun to preach to the choir. Well, so that's absurd, but sort of makes sense. Well, let's say they wouldn't pay for psychotherapy for somebody under 9 months. Okay, well, that makes sense. Right, and psychotherapy can include all kinds of behavioral play. It doesn't mean sitting there talking with adult talk. When I went to Norway 15 years ago to Schizophrenia Days conference, we're going to stop here in a second. So they call it Schizophrenia Days. The whole community takes place. The mayor comes out. The Queen of Denmark, Norway, came to the conference. And it's a standard protocol there. When you get a diagnosis of schizophrenia or acute psychosis, you automatically get 2 years of individual psychotherapy as part of your treatment package. Automatically. Yeah. So it's time to stop. Thank you for listening.